The 17th of January 1940, Fort Benning, Georgia. The air hangs heavy with red clay dust. The sun cuts low through the pines as a column of M2. A 4 light tanks rumbles across the training grounds, their riveted hulls clattering like tin cans filled with bolts. Inside the lead tank, Second Lieutenant James Holloway presses his leather helmet against the hot steel interior, shouting orders into the void. His words vanish into the mechanical roar. No response. The tank beside him veers left when it should hold right. The formation collapses into chaos. Holloway slams his fist against the turret wall, the metallic clang swallowed by engine noise. In this moment, in this quiet corner of Georgia, far from any battlefield, the United States Army confronts a truth more dangerous than enemy fire. Its tanks cannot speak to one another. This is not a story of heroism. Not yet. This is a story of silence, of a military power that could build ships and planes and factories that stretched beyond the horizon, but could not make its armored fist move as one. In 1940, while the world watches German panzers slice through France with choreographed precision, American tank crews communicate with flags, hand signals, and desperate prayers. They are blind, deaf, isolated inside steel coffins that cannot coordinate, cannot adapt, cannot survive modern warfare. This is the story of how that silence nearly doomed a generation, and how its breaking changed the very nature of armored combat forever. The problem begins long before Fort Benning, long before the red clay and the shouting lieutenants. It begins in the philosophy of American military doctrine itself. Throughout the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds, the United States views tanks not as independent striking forces, but as infantry support, slow-moving pillboxes, meant to crawl alongside foot soldiers, suppressing machine gun nests and breaking through barbed wire. The doctrine inherits its DNA from the Great War, from the muddy crawl across no man's land, from the belief that tanks exist only to help men on foot cross lethal ground. In this vision, tanks need no radios. They need only to keep pace with the walking soldier, to follow predetermined paths, to execute orders given before the battle begins. Flexibility is not considered. Communication is not prioritized. The tank is a tool, not a weapon system, but the world has moved on. In September 1939, Wehrmacht panzer divisions pour across the Polish border, and the world witnesses something it has never seen before. German armour does not crawl. It sprints. Tank formations of dozens, sometimes hundreds of vehicles move in coordinated thrusts, exploiting breakthroughs, encircling entire armies, communicating constantly through sophisticated radio networks. Every German tank from platoon leader upward carries a receiver. Many carry transmitters. They speak to each other, adjust to changing conditions, flow like water through gaps in enemy lines. This is not infantry support. This is mechanized warfare fluid, adaptive, lethal, and it requires one thing above all else. The United States Army watches from across the ocean. Officers crowd around newsreels, studying grainy footage of panzer columns slicing through Polish cavalry and French fortifications. Some begin to understand, but understanding comes slowly when it challenges decades of doctrine, when it demands budgets that don't exist, when it requires admitting that American armor is a generation behind. In 1940, the U.S. Army possesses fewer than 400 tanks. Most are obsolete M2 light tanks, mounting only machine guns. Radio equipment is scarce, unreliable, expensive. The Signal Corps jealously guards radio production for infantry and artillery. Tank crews, when they receive radios at all, get cast-off SCR 2-4-5 sets originally designed for cavalry devices, so temperamental they fail in rain, in heat, in dust, in everything the battlefield provides. Lieutenant Holloway knows this intimately. After the failed January maneuvers, he submits a report that vanishes into the bureaucratic void. Without reliable voice communication, he writes, tank platoons cannot execute combined maneuvers. We are not a formation. We are 5 individual tanks that happen to be driving in the same direction. His frustration echoes through a generation of junior officers who see the future arriving and know they are unprepared. But reports do not change doctrine. Money changes doctrine. Crisis changes doctrine. And in 1940, America has neither. Yet something begins to shift, slowly, like tectonic plates grinding before an earthquake. In May 1940, Germany launches Fall Gelb Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. In 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht destroys what was considered the finest army in Europe. French tanks are often superior to German panzers in armor and armament, but they cannot coordinate. Most French tanks carry no radios. Commanders must dismount to confer, waving maps beside their vehicles, while German formations flow around them like water around stones. The French fight bravely, desperately, but they fight blind and isolated. On June 22, France surrenders. The shockwave reaches Washington within hours. Now, finally, crisis. Now, finally, money. Congress, which spent a decade starving the military budget, suddenly discovers urgency. Appropriations flood toward rearmament. The army expands from 190,000 men toward eventual millions. Tank production accelerates. New designs emerge, the M3 Grant, then the M4 Sherman. But tanks are useless without coordination, and coordination requires radios that work. The pressure falls on the signal corps, on manufacturers scattered across the industrial heartland, on engineers who must solve in months what peacetime might have taken years. The technical challenges are staggering. A tank radio must withstand conditions that would destroy civilian equipment within minutes. It must function in 100-degree heat and below zero cold. It must survive vibration that rattles fillings loose, dust that infiltrates every seal, moisture that corrodes connections, electrical interference from the tank's own engine and generators. It must be simple enough for conscripts to operate under fire, robust enough to keep working when everything else fails, powerful enough to transmit across miles of rolling terrain. And it must be produced in quantities that peacetime industry has never imagined. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of units. The solution emerges piecemeal, through desperation and innovation in equal measure. Engineers at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, begin adapting frequency-modulated technology that promises better noise rejection than traditional amplitude modulation. The SCR-508 vehicle radio system takes shape, a combination transmitter-receiver operating in the 2027.9 MHz frequency range with enough power to reach 10 miles under good conditions, maybe 3 or 4 in combat. It is not elegant. The set weighs over 100 pounds, requires careful tuning, and occupies precious space inside already cramped turrets. But it works. More importantly, it can be manufactured. Production begins in 1941, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as America's industrial base awakens from its depression slumber. Factories in Chicago, Detroit, New York retool assembly lines. Workers who have never seen the inside of a tank learn to solder connections that must survive artillery concussion. Quality control inspectors develop new tests, new standards. The radios improve with each production run, more reliable seals, better vibration mounting, clearer audio. By Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American tank production has climbed above 1,000 vehicles per month, and nearly all of them carry working radios. The blind are beginning to see. But hardware alone does not create coordination. Technology must meet doctrine, and doctrine must change. The old infantry support model tanks crawling beside foot soldiers, executing preset plans becomes obsolete the moment tanks can talk to each other. If armor can communicate, it can maneuver independently. If it can maneuver independently, it can exploit breakthroughs, can encircle, can strike deep behind enemy lines. The tank transforms from tool to weapon system, from support to spearhead. This philosophical shift rewrites field manuals, changes training regimens, creates entirely new tactical vocabularies. Young officers absorb these lessons with the fervor of converts. At Fort Knox, Kentucky, The Armored Force School becomes a laboratory for the new warfare. Instructors emphasize radio discipline, clear communication protocols, the ability to adjust plans in real time based on information flowing through the network. Tank commanders learn to fight with their eyes and ears beyond their own vehicle, monitoring multiple frequencies, coordinating with adjacent units, calling for artillery support or airstrikes. The tank platoon becomes an organism, each vehicle a cell connected through invisible webs of radio waves. The transformation is incomplete when America enters the war. Pearl Harbor changes everything, and nothing accelerates timelines without granting wisdom. In early 1942, the 1st American armor deploys to North Africa, where it will face Rommel's Afrika Korps, the most experienced panzer force in the world. The Americans have radios now, good radios, but they do not yet understand how to use them. Doctrine is still catching up to technology. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German armor mauls inexperienced American tank battalions, exploiting gaps, encircling isolated units. The Americans have the tools, but not the experience. Radio chatter fills with confusion, panic, contradictory orders. Coordination collapses not from equipment failure, but from human error, from officers overwhelmed by the speed and violence of mechanized combat. But armies learn. The survivors of Kasserine absorb brutal lessons. Radio protocols tighten. Officers learn to speak calmly, clearly, even when their tank is burning. Redundancy becomes doctrine. Every tank maintains contact with neighbors, reports, observations, creates a collective picture of the battlefield that no single crew could achieve alone. By the time Allied armor drives toward Tunis in spring 1943, coordination has improved dramatically. Tank platoons move as units, responding to threats, supporting each other, sharing information in real time. The radio network has become the nervous system of armored warfare. The true test comes in Western Europe. On the 6th of June, 1944, Allied armor begins landing on Normandy beaches, and the breakout battles of July and August demonstrate how far American armored doctrine has evolved. Operation Cobra, the breakthrough from the Normandy hedgerows, depends entirely on radio coordination. Hundreds of tanks, tank destroyers, armored cars move in synchronized thrusts, communications linking them not just to each other, but to artillery, to fighter bombers, to infantry, to headquarters miles behind the lines. The radio network creates a system of warfare where information flows faster than the enemy can respond, where isolated German units face enemies that seem to know everything, appear everywhere, coordinate across impossible distances. German tank crews, veterans of 5 years of war, encounter something they have never experienced before. American armor that moves with purpose, responds to threats collectively, calls down devastating artillery fire within minutes of contact. The Americans have not just matched German radio capability, they have industrialized it, standardized it, extended it through their entire force structure. Every American tank can communicate, every tank destroyer, every reconnaissance vehicle, every command post. The network has become so comprehensive that it grants a qualitative advantage beyond mere numbers. American tankers fight collectively while German units, fuel-starved and communication degraded, fight increasingly as isolated individuals. Lieutenant Joseph Ahrens, commanding a Sherman platoon in the 3rd Armored Division, later describes the experience of the rapid advance across France in August 1944. "We didn't need to see the enemy to know where they were," he recalls in his post-war memoir. Radio reports from scouts, from infantry, from other tank platoons built a picture in your head. You knew where your neighbors were, what they were facing, where you needed to be. We moved like a school of fish, responding to threats before they materialized. The Germans were good, experienced, but they were fighting blind while we could see. This is coordination, finally working not perfectly, not without mistakes and miscommunications and tragic failures, but fundamentally, systematically working. The radio network has become so integral to American armored operations that its absence becomes unthinkable. Tank commanders who lose radio contact immediately abort maneuvers, fall back to visual range with other units, restore communication before proceeding. The radio is not equipment, it is oxygen. Yet the full implications extend beyond tactics, beyond even operational art. The reliable tank radio network creates a fundamentally democratic form of warfare. In German panzer doctrine, genius commanders like Guderian or Rommel execute brilliant maneuvers through force of personality and tactical brilliance. The German system depends on exceptional leaders making brilliant decisions. The American system distributes intelligence across the network, empowers junior officers with information that would have reached only senior commanders in earlier wars. A sergeant commanding a single tank can call for artillery support, can report enemy positions that reshape division-level operations, can make tactical decisions based on information flowing from across the battlefield. The network flattens hierarchy, democratizes information, creates a system that functions even when senior leadership fails. This philosophical difference reflects something deeper than military doctrine. It reflects American industrial culture, the mass production mentality that values interchangeable parts and standardized processes over individual craftsmanship. German tanks are often mechanically superior, better armor, better guns, sophisticated engineering. But they are complex, difficult to maintain, produced in limited numbers. American Shermans are simpler, easier to repair, manufactured in staggering quantities. The same philosophy governs radio networks. American communication equipment is standardized, mass-produced, distributed so widely that losing individual units barely matters. The network survives because it is redundant, distributed, democratic in its architecture. German prisoners interrogated after the Battle of the Bulge in winter 1944-45 repeatedly mention American radio capability with something approaching awe. One Panzer lieutenant, captured near Bastogne, tells his interrogators, "You could hear them talking constantly, calm, organized, even when we had them surrounded. They always knew where their neighbors were, where help was coming from. We felt like we were fighting an enemy that could see through fog." This is the voice of a veteran, recognizing that technological advantage has shifted permanently against him. The radio network also enables coordination with air power in ways that previous armies never achieved. American tank columns in 1944 and 1945 operate with forward air controllers embedded in the formation, coordinating strikes from fighter bombers overhead. The P-47 Thunderbolts that devastate German armor in the Falaise pocket receive targeting information from tank crews on the ground, creating a kill chain that moves at the speed of radio waves. The Wehrmacht, by 1944, largely stripped of air cover, faces an enemy where ground and air forces function as a single organism, coordinated through that invisible web of radio communication. By the time American armor crosses the Rhine in March 1945, the transformation is complete. The same army that in 1940 could barely coordinate a 5-tank platoon now executes multi-division armored thrusts across hundreds of miles, maintaining coherence, adjusting to enemy resistance, exploiting opportunities with a speed that leaves German commanders bewildered. The final campaigns in Germany resemble pursuit more than battle. American armor racing forward, German resistance collapsing not from lack of courage, but from inability to coordinate defense against an enemy that moves faster than information can travel through their degraded communication networks. The symbolic object that captures this transformation is not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but a sound, the crackling voice emerging from the radio speaker, carrying information, orders, reassurance. That sound represents connection, the knowledge that you are not alone inside your steel box, that help is coordinating toward your position, that your observations matter to the collective effort. German tankers in the final year of the war increasingly fight in radio silence, conserving fuel, trying to hide from the omnipresent Allied reconnaissance. They have learned that transmitting a radio signal often brings death from above within minutes. The airwaves themselves have become an American domain. The epilogue of this story extends far beyond 1945. The lessons learned about armored coordination, about radio networks as force multipliers, about the democratization of battlefield intelligence, these become foundational principles for modern military doctrine. The revolution that began with unreliable SCR-245 sets in 1940 evolves into the networked warfare of the 21st century, where every vehicle, every soldier, every weapons platform connects through digital networks that would seem like science fiction to Lieutenant Holloway shouting into the void at Fort Benning. But the core principle remains unchanged. Isolated forces, no matter how powerful, cannot survive against coordinated enemies. Communication is not a luxury or an afterthought, it is the foundation of modern warfare. The tank radio network of World War II proved that technology alone is insufficient. Equipment must meet doctrine. Doctrine must meet training. Training must meet the reality of combat. The United States in 1940 possessed the industrial capacity to build radios, but lacked the doctrine to use them. By 1945, it had created a system where technology and tactics reinforced each other, where coordination became second nature, where the network itself became a weapon more powerful than any single tank. The deeper truth this story reveals concerns the nature of American power itself. The United States did not win World War II through military genius or tactical brilliance. It won through systems, through industrial capacity, logistical sophistication, and the ability to coordinate vast resources across global distances. The tank radio network exemplifies this approach. It succeeded not because it was the most advanced technology, but because it was reliable, mass-produced, standardized, and integrated into a doctrine that valued collective action over individual heroism. This is democracy applied to warfare, distributed authority, shared information, standardized systems that function even when individual components fail. In the end, the story of American tank radios is a story about overcoming institutional inertia, about crisis forcing innovation, about the grinding process of transforming doctrine to match technological capability. It is a story told in thousands of small moments: engineers testing connections in laboratory conditions, factory workers soldering components they don't fully understand, tank crews learning to speak calmly while under fire, officers rewriting field manuals to incorporate lessons purchased with blood. There is no single hero, no decisive invention, no dramatic turning point. There is only the accumulation of incremental improvements until, collectively, they achieve something previous generations would have considered impossible. The red clay dust still hangs in the air at Fort Benning. The pines still cut sharp shadows across the training grounds, but the tanks no longer lumber in confused isolation. They move as one, coordinated through invisible channels, each crew connected to its neighbors, to its commanders, to the vast network of information and support that defines modern military power. The silence has been broken, and in that breaking, the nature of warfare itself transformed forever. This is not simply a story about radios. It is a story about the power of connection, about how isolated strength pales before coordinated effort, about how technology alone is meaningless without the doctrine and training to employ it effectively. The tank crews of 1,940, shouting unheard orders into mechanical thunder, could not have imagined the networked battlefield their successors would inherit. But their frustration, their recognition that something fundamental was missing, planted seeds that would grow into the most sophisticated military communication systems ever created. The symbolic lesson transcends military history. In any endeavor, isolation breeds vulnerability. Connection creates resilience. Information shared becomes information multiplied. The tank that fights alone, no matter how powerful, cannot survive against coordinated enemies, but the tank that fights as part of a network, that shares what it sees, that benefits from the observations of dozens or hundreds of others, that tank becomes nearly invincible not through its own strength, but through the collective power of the system it inhabits. American tankers in World War II learned this lesson in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable. They learned it in North African deserts and Norman hedgerows, in Belgian forests and German industrial valleys. They learned it through mistakes that cost lives, through innovations that saved thousands, through the slow, painful process of transforming doctrine to match capability. The radio network they created stands as testament to a particular kind of power, not the power of individual genius or technological superiority, but the power of coordinated effort, of distributed intelligence, of systems that function because they are designed for resilience rather than perfection. 75 years later, that crackling voice emerging from the radio speaker still echoes through military doctrine, still shapes how democratic societies organize military force, still reminds us that the strongest defense against chaos is communication, coordination, connection. In 1940, America had no reliable tank radios, and coordination failed. By 1945, coordination had become second nature, woven so deeply into operational doctrine that its absence became unthinkable. That transformation from isolated silence to networked power remains one of the most consequential military revolutions of the modern era. The tanks roll on. The radios crackle with calm voices sharing information, coordinating movement, building collective awareness that no individual could achieve alone. And in that simple act of communication, in that breaking of isolation, lies a truth larger than warfare. We are stronger together than apart, more capable when connected than isolated, more resilient when information flows freely than when hoarded. The tank radio network of World War II proved this principle on the largest, most lethal stage imaginable. Its lesson endures, transmitted across generations, a signal that even silence and distance cannot erase.